Bratislava Forum side event Cooperative Security Initiative. My name is Alex Martin. I'm the head of GLOBSEC Brussels office. And this is an initiative very dear to us that together with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Vienna office and with the endorsement of the OSCE and the support of the Slovak chairmanship last year, we kicked off an initiative that would bring experts from the entire OSCE space to discuss cooperative security and how to move forward this agenda within the institution. It is my great honor to moderate the session today, to co-moderate the session today, together with my colleague Alexandra Dines, senior researcher at FES ROCPE. And before we kick off with the initial presentation about the Cooperative Security Initiative and the campaign results after we surveyed about 300 people from the entire OSCE space, I would like to introduce my panel, or our panel today, and those that we will pick their brains later on how to move the cooperative security agenda forward. So we have with us Ambassador Luca Frattini, Director of the Office of the Secretary General, the OSCE in Vienna, Ambassador Thomas Graminger, former Secretary General of the OSCE and a Swiss diplomat, a big also supporter of the Cooperative Security Initiative. We have Edward Lucas, non-resident fellow, senior fellow at CIPA and a good friend of GLOBSEC, and Julie Wilhelmsen, senior fellow, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and also a member of the CSI expert panel. As I mentioned, I will co-moderate the discussion today with Alexandra. And before we have a chance to discuss how we make cooperative security function again, I want to hand over to Alexandra to give you the results of our CSI campaign for the following minutes and some interesting results on the questions for a safer future that we put out for the public to respond. So Alexandra, if you can start sharing the screen. Oh, one housekeeping note. We are running until 1 p.m. So we have about an hour and 25 minutes from now onwards. If you have questions, please use the chat function to raise your hand or saying that you have a question. We would love to bring you on the screen with your camera on and ask the questions yourself to the panelist or panelists that you're interested to receive an answer to. And you can also start your cameras now, but please keep your microphones on mute in order to avoid echo or other type of noise disturbances. With that being said, Alexandra, take over from here, and then we'll get back to the panel after we find the results of the CSI campaign.
Thank you very much, Alex, and good morning to our honorable panel and the guests. I'm very glad to say a few words about CSI so that you have a more general understanding of how this initiative came about and why it's important in current times, and then happily share my screen and present the most interesting results from the survey of 300 interested citizens and experts across the OSCE space, as Alex already indicated. You know, the Cooperative Security Initiative grew out of sense of urgency, and I think we all agree that the European security order is currently under threat, and there are many signs of that: deteriorating arms control agreements and those safety nets that used to be there in their form, but also in form of confidence and security building measures, seem to be not working as well as they used to, bringing us, in the worst case, if we were to think alarmist, perhaps on the brink of a broader conflict or perhaps even a war, if we continue along the trend and path on which we are now. We have conflicts in EU's neighborhood. We have been all following the recent news. It's been flaring up closer and closer to the EU. And we have very difficult relations with Russia and generally divisions and distrust between Russia and the West. So soon after the end of the Cold War and the time when we all hope that we will live in democracy and peace and prosperity, this dream was actually shattered and put in big question. And the interesting thing is that both sides, Russia and the West, to make it a bit simple in this juxtaposition, both sides seem convinced that they're on the winning side, that they're right, that time is on their side, and that the other side needs to change first. Obviously, this is a downward spiral, and GLOBSEC and our little think tank, FES Regional Office for Cooperation and Peace in Europe, came together and decided to join forces and to ask a question: how can we actually change this dangerous trajectory? How can we reverse the trend, come back from the brink in a way, and how can we shift momentum back towards cooperative security and multilateralism through the OSCE in order to build a safer future? And you see already from this idea that there's a big link to the panel of eminent persons and their report back to diplomacy. So this was the reason why we gathered together 19 experts from 19 OSCE member states, chosen in their personal capacity and based on their expertise in European security affairs, but also their interest in cooperative security. We launched last year at the GLOBSEC forum a year and a half ago with the support of Slovakian chairman in office of the OSCE and endorsed by Thomas Greminger, then Secretary General of the OSCE. As Alex already indicated, the experts, members of the Cooperative Security Initiative, decided not to bring out yet another report, but rather to pose questions. So we have 19 experts and 19 questions for Safer Europe, some of which I will present to you in terms of the results. And not only our 19 experts answered the questions, one question per expert, so to speak, but also we decided to involve broader public. So we did this survey, online survey with the help of SurveyMonkey, putting the 19 questions out there online and inviting interested citizens, experts, students to take part. So 300 people took part, and we have experts, students, public sector, private sector employees, and diplomats. 2/3 coming from Germany, Russia, Ukraine, US, Serbia, Belarus, so very important OSCE member states, and about 1/3 of all other OSCE member states. And additionally to that, we also did a social media campaign, posting online and spreading the word about cooperative security through video testimonials, but also explanatory cartoons. And in addition to that, just to finish this kind of introduction to the Cooperative Security Initiative as a multifaceted project, we did online talk shows, 3 of them, one with female activists in the areas of climate, migration, and human rights, to discuss with them, with the future or current generation, how to go about challenges that all of us face now. Another talk show with politicians, and another one with a high-profile international journalist. So now I would like to share the most interesting results from our survey. So here we will have a look at the responses of those 300 people. And you probably wonder, how can I show you the responses from a non-representative survey? Just to make it a bit clearer, we had not just yes and no questions, it was like boxes where people could write a longer text. So it was a qualitative survey, and indeed most of the people did. And we collected all the responses and analyzed them with the help of an online tool, data analysis tool. So we coded the responses and tried to distill from them those messages that I will be showing to you now. Let's see if that works. Wait a sec. So now you should be seeing the slide with the kind of nuclear symbol. I would like to present here the results to the question that is from the part we framed sense of urgency. Is there a risk of nuclear exchange? Interesting enough, most people, about half, said no. The system of mutually assured destruction, after all, deters leaders from taking this devastating and irresponsible step. So this is what we distilled from those people who tended to say no. Still, 1/3 of our respondents said it's possible. They said, yes, there is a risk of a nuclear exchange because of the deteriorating arms control agreements and the atmosphere of distrust. So in this sense, a nuclear Armageddon is closer than any time since the Cold War. And this is indeed very alarming. And a sizable minority, about 10%, said maybe there is a certain risk, especially in the case of the so-called dirt bomb, so when nuclear weapons could end up in the hands of terrorists, or miscalculations or accidents. This was another worry of our respondents. Let me go to the next question. Now, I hope the system works and you should be seeing the slide with a few puzzle pieces. We move to challenges. We ask the question, what are the challenges on which states need to work together because they cannot be addressed on their own? And here the most prominent responses are represented by the biggest pieces of the puzzle. Issues like migration, obviously healthcare / pandemics, climate change, and cyber threats were named the most frequently. But also such threats that transcend borders, such as terrorism, nuclear non-proliferation, poverty, drug trafficking, transnational crimes, have been also named quite often. So here we can already notice that many threats, according to our respondents, transcend borders and indeed cannot be solved bilaterally or unilaterally by any single state alone. On the following slide, I would like to present a very interesting question, and indeed a lot of the discussion revolves around the role of Russia. Should Russia be part of the European security system? Interestingly, almost 70% of our respondents said yes. They said Russia should be part of the European security system because, after all, it's a member of the OSCE and a major European nuclear power that faces similar threats like the rest of Europe. But the interesting result of this question, since again, people were allowed and able to write their thoughts, not just yes and no for ticking the boxes, this yes came with many strings attached or conditions. So most people wrote certain conditions how Russia should change in order to be part of the European security system. And among those wishes for the future, how Russia should change, is that Russia should give up Crimea and resolve the conflicts in the shared neighborhood with the European Union that it has sparked, that it stops undermining security and sovereignty of neighbors, and that it generally plays by the rules, democratizes, and embraces European values. You see, that's quite a list. We posed the same question with regard to the United States, like I would like to show you on this following slide. Interestingly, in the same way, about 70% of our respondents to our qualitative survey said yes, the United States should be part of the European security system because, after all, it's a traditional partner that subscribes to similar values and displays unique military and economic capacity. This is kind of the, we analyzed all those responses. This is a summary of different responses that the yes people said. And again, there were many qualifications and strings attached, and similar like to Russia, there were certain conditions posed, certain things that the US should change in the future in order to be part of the European security system. Among those conditions was the wish to behave as an equal partner and not as a sovereign, to support, buttress European security without controlling it, to actively support EU integration and strategic autonomy, and stop confusing economic interests with security interests. And finally, last but not least, I would like to present from our perspective one of the most interesting questions, which points to the way ahead. We asked our respondents how they envision the future of the European security in the next 5 to 10 years. And here you see in the middle of the slide our symbol of the Cooperative Security Initiative, the alarm clock. And in a way, it's not a coincidence. We want to enhance the sense of urgency and show that we need to start somehow rethinking the dangerous status quo now. And at the same time, this clock, this alarm clock, reminds us of the doomsday clock. Many of you probably have thought about it when they saw this 5 or 4 to 12 time. And indeed, interestingly, our results in terms of visions of the future or options for the future happen to fit very nicely with this kind of doomsday clock. So maybe to start with the most negative scenario, the insecurity envisioned by about 14% of our population, the 300 people we surveyed. And again, I remind you, these were not the options given to the people. These were, we distilled those 4 options from what people described in their own language. In the scenario of insecurity, obviously, cooperative security does not work, and major players compete for the spheres of influence, and divide the world. The EU being caught in between major powers such as Russia or China or the United States. Challenges such as epidemics, economic crisis, poverty and migration increase, and rising nationalism leads to bilateralism, an arms race, and growing insecurity. Again, a minority of our surveyed people said they envision the future this way, but still this is, a gloomy option. The next option I would like to present is cooperative security. About a quarter of our surveyed experts viewed the future in this way. This means that all countries of the OSCE cooperate peacefully and are more interconnected than ever before. Security is indivisible, and multilateral institutions and international organizations grow in importance, and self-critical reflection pushed countries to seek win-win opportunities and engage in effective arms control. This is the vision of cooperative security. Two middle scenarios, so to speak, that I'm going to present now. One of them is called partial insecurity. This is pretty much the status quo scenario. Cooperative security is not achieved in this option, but ad hoc coalitions of the willing cooperate in niche fields, and Europe positions itself kind of between US and China. The EU remains divided on many issues, does not speak with one voice. Ukraine conflict is simmering, and generally no big breakthroughs are in sight. Finally, partial security, which is a slightly more positive middle option. In this case, cooperative security works for those actors who are willing to cooperate. So again, kind of those cooperation of coalitions of the willing. The EU is more united, however, has its own army and is more independent of the US influence. Russia is not part of the European security, but a constructive dialogue is ongoing. In this scenario, the Ukraine conflict is resolved and some kind of accommodation with China is yet to be found. I stop sharing my screen and try to come up with a kind of summary word. As you have seen from these selected results of our survey, cooperative security is only one option of the future, and you saw the other ones. We and the group of the 19 experts who are part of the initiative argue that this option is a better and a safer one. It's up to debate, and we can discuss it in the panel. Obviously, cooperative security cannot be achieved quickly. We are very realistic here. We know it is a process and it's bound to be a long and probably painful process. But, and this is the essence of Cooperative Security Initiative, it needs to be started now. And that's the sense of urgency that we would like to envision through this alarm clock. So now it's time to go back to cooperative security, and I'm very happy to listen to the remarks of our distinguished panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. This is a really nice segue for me to kick off the conversation with the panelists. And what we heard, I will start with the last question. The best scenario would be to have full cooperative security, but we also need to be super realistic that we live in a highly fragmented world with clashes of powers, with a rising power China, with an American power seem to be in decline, and with the European Union struggling within, let's put it that way, and an OSCE that currently is seen in a stalemate at the end of the day. So my question to you, and I will start with Luca, we'll go in that order as listed in the invitation. How do we make cooperative security function again, in particular within the OSCE framework, which is the only framework that currently brings the West and Russia together? And if you could also bring into conversation, what are those areas where we could maybe find that middle ground to start cooperating again, instead of just having our own positions and own narratives and leave the table because we feel that we are right and the others are wrong. So Luca, over to you, and then we'll continue with the panel with the same question.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. And I will try to keep my first round short, 3-4 minutes, as you indicated, So probably it won't give me enough time to go to the more specific questions, but I look forward to contributing later on those. Let me say, first of all, in general, that I'm honored to be in such a great panel, and thanks for putting this together. I think it's very timely. The OSCE may probably be referred as an embodiment of the notion of cooperative security. So this is already a way to introduce the relevance that this debate has for the OSCE and probably vice versa. I think that when my former boss, Thomas, whom I salute, together with the Slovak chairmanship last year, endorsed and supported the launching of the Cooperative Security Initiative, it was precisely meant to revitalize this debate on cooperative security, among other things. And if I look at it from today's perspective, when we discussed the first results of the initiative, with all that the current crisis and issues that are going on, from Nagorno-Karabakh to Kyrgyzstan to Belarus, not to mention Ukraine, of course, plus what is referred to by some as the OSCE leadership crisis, which on a more neutral note, I would call the interim period. You may think that rather than vice versa, it is the OSCE itself who needs support and help. And I would offer this angle also for the conversation. Just to give you a practical example, we are organizing as the OSCE Secretariat, together with the Albanian chairmanship and the Czech Republic and Slovakia, we're going to have a security day dedicated to the 30 years of the Paris Charter and the lessons therein next week on the 16th of October. And when we were planning on publicizing the event on social media, for example, we got a pushback in terms of our social media accounts currently being invaded by comments, especially coming from the South Caucasus region, on how useless and how basically nonsensical our organization is because it doesn't manage to solve the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, even on unrelated topics. So this is how deep the crisis of multilateralism and cooperative security can be, to the extent that even a positive initiative is portrayed as something without any usefulness. It is true only partially, of course. We are still the OSCE, and we have the participating states. It is good and works well to the extent that we do invest in it. So the more the participating states invest in the organization, and I'm not only talking about money here, you know that the financial contributions to the budget of the organization, of course, are at stake. We have been constantly under a zero nominal growth trend, and this is certainly not good, but I'm also speaking about political capital investment, even more than human and financial resources. And the same applies to the cooperative approach to security. Now it's out of fashion, okay? We have a logic of unilateralism, nationalism, cavalier seul, and that is what is prevailing. We hear it on a daily basis, but we know full well, and I think this group is the best placed to know, that in order to survive peacefully, states need to cooperate. So once we have the assumption that war and conflict is not a lasting solution, then definitely there is still space for multilateralism and cooperative security. The CSI helps, in my opinion. It helps to keep the notion alive. It helps to understand the challenges this same notion encounters. And if I may, it also serves to adjust and update our meaning of cooperative security. So this is probably the most important lesson that I would like to learn from today's discussion and beyond. Certainly, we in the OSCE do not have the magic button to press to make cooperative security great again, at least not yet. Most probably recipes can be found, but we cannot risk too much in terms of continuing with the trial and error method. We have to play safe. So I think the best way is to do it gradually and incrementally by very small steps. And the precondition for that, for me, is to keep all the channels of communication open, to keep this subject afloat through events such as this one, such as the one I referred to for next week that we're organizing, and whichever other event and opportunity that participating states are ready to support. I would like to close this first round with one reference to what Alexandra presented, especially the question regarding the challenges. She mentioned among the main answers, the topics that were most mentioned were migration, health, climate change, cybersecurity, and terrorism. Well, out of these 5, let me just note that apart from the health one, and we certainly do not aspire to be a health organization, but the other 4 are fully in the portfolio of the OSCE, which shows once more the relevance of the organization for cooperative security. And I would like to end my intervention with this. Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you very much, Luca. And I think that to me, the most important part that yes, we need to start a conversation on updating the meaning of cooperative security, or reconceptualizing and managing the expectations in the current security landscape, which is nowhere close to, I don't know, 10 years ago or before. And Thomas, I want to move to you to get your views and updates also from the person that has led the negotiations, formal, informal, bilateral and multilateral. And also if you could touch on the issue of political will. How do we entice participating states and politicians and decision makers to actually wanting to communicate in whatever form or shape they would like, but actually keeping that channel of communication open?
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. A pleasure to join you this morning. Let me at the outset thank again GLOBSEC and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for the courage to keep marketing, promoting this concept of cooperative security that indeed is not particularly fashionable in these times of confrontation. I listened very carefully yesterday to the session entitled Defragmenting the World, Envisioning a More Cooperative Future. And frankly, I was not sure that everybody on the panel was really familiar with the concept of cooperative security. Still, I felt a few very important points were made in that conversation, and I would actually like to take it from there. So I will basically make 2 points. My first, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan, Mukhtar Gioberdi, he started out by saying it's all about dialogue. And he illustrated his point by highlighting the resolve of Central Asian heads of states to establish a regular platform for dialogue among themselves. That then in turn allowed to give a strong political stimulus to regional cooperation. And I would argue that indeed a strong political commitment to genuine dialogue is a centerpiece of cooperative security. And another important point that was made in yesterday's panel is that dialogue can and should be maintained also in difficult and challenging times. It was General John Allen, representing Brookings, that reminded us that even in the darkest moments of the Cold War, we talk to our adversaries. And he also insisted that talking to an adversary does not mean that you give up on your values, as long as you make sure that your values are at full display. So what would this imply in today's realities for an organization like the OEC? Well, I would argue use available platforms for genuine dialogue. Use, for instance, the structured dialogue that was created by the Hamburg Ministerial Council end of 2016 to have a serious conversation about measures to de-escalate tensions in Europe, instead of undermining the very format by insisting on toxic and confrontational topics. Use the structured dialogue to promote additional transparency measures. Use it to work on preventing and managing incidents. Use it to enhance male-male dialogue. So basically what I'm saying, platforms are out there, but obviously they only make sense when they're being used by participating states. This takes me to my second point. Dietmir Bushati, the ex-Minister of Foreign Affairs of Albania and today's special representative of the Albanian OEC chair, said that it is key to restore trust. And then the moderator, Stefanie Lichtenstein, a very powerful OEC advocate that we all know, insisted that, yes, indeed, the OEC would have to offer a lot in areas where interests converge. And I think this is a very important point. I do believe that there is an obvious interest to identify areas where interests between different stakeholders, including non-like-minded ones, converge, and build areas of cooperation that would allow to do two things. On the one hand, successfully address current security challenges, and on the other, rebuild trust at the same time. This is a concept, an approach that was referred to by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung as islands of cooperation a couple of years ago. Now, where would I look for these islands of cooperation? I believe they can be found among the so-called transnational threats. And Luca alluded to some of them, older or more recent ones, be it countering terrorism and preventing violent extremism, be it combating trafficking in human beings, drugs and arms, be it promoting cybersecurity or responding, and now I come to more recent ones, be it responding to the repercussions of illicit migration, climate change, or modern technology on security. All these challenges clearly transcend borders. They need to be addressed by international cooperation, and even the most powerful states cannot deal with them on their own. So there is an obvious case for cooperative security there. While I'm confident that this represents a promising way forward, it will need to be combined with progress in resolving conflict on our continent, given the relevance for trust or the lack thereof among European security actors. So we need progress towards resolving existing conflicts in the OEC area. It is urgent to fully implement the Minsk agreements, which, as we all know, would not be the end of a process, but an important stepping stone for developing a sustainable settlement of the crisis in around Ukraine. And then, as we are being demonstrated these days, we urgently need to move forward in resolving the protracted conflicts in our area. So basically, and to conclude, I'm advocating for a parallel process to restore trust. On the one hand, addressing common security challenges together in a spirit of genuine dialogue, and at the same time, parties and key stakeholders need to muster the necessary political will to advance the resolution of existing conflicts in the OEC area. I hand it back to you, Alex.
Thank you, Thomas. So I want to bring you, Edward, in the conversation because you're a bit further away from the previous panelists. You don't have a connection to the OSCE, as far as I know. So Thomas just mentioned, Thomas mentioned trust. We need to have the space for shared security challenges to tackle them together. In my field, in the conflict management field, we call that ZOPA, or Zone of Possible Agreement, to deal together with an issue, and the issue of political will. So how do you see these elements? Or is cooperative security something that just doesn't happen because of this moment in time, anywhere, everywhere, or is something deeper to that? Over to you, Edward.
Well, thanks very much. And this is fascinating. Greetings from rainy London. I think I'm sure the sun is shining in Bratislava and everywhere else. I have to say, I'm pretty skeptical about this. I think there are two big shifts. I remember the Paris Charter really clearly. I was living in the Baltic states then, which was still, I think, still occupied by the Soviet Union. But this idea that there was both a common foundation of values, everybody basically believed in democracy and solving disputes peacefully, and the America was entrenched in European security, and everyone thought that was natural. And we just aren't in that era anymore. And we see both the United States, which is firmly now of the belief, at least with this administration, that we're in an era of geopolitical competition. And I have to say, I think that's right. I think if you're looking more broadly outside Europe, that there is a competition, ruthless competition between particularly China and the United States, but to some extent also between Russia and China and Russia and the United States. And that's a different sort of era. It's not the Paris Charter era anymore. And so I think the normative foundation has changed. And the arenas in which we're arguing are very different too. You know, we had the world of arms control, nuclear arms control, which is still very important, and I was glad to see it highlighted, is very structured. It's about throw weights and things that you can measure pretty clearly. And I still think that there's room to talk about nukes. We could talk about nukes to the Brezhnev Soviet Union. We can certainly talk about it to the Kremlin, and we should, I think, urgently be trying to bring China into a global arms control framework. But a lot of the security challenges now are much vaguer and more slippery. The so-called hybrid warfare, which I prefer to call by its old name of activní мероприятия, active measures, assassinations on critics living abroad, subversion, the use of disinformation, of disinformation. These aren't completely new, but they've become front and center in the terms of way in which countries interact with each other in a way that is that's quite unfamiliar. So, for example, the enormous efforts that the Chinese Communist Party is making to hoover up protected personal information, a whole new front in the intelligence war. Hundreds of millions of people, I guess, at a guess, I would say everybody on this panel and everybody listening to this panel will have had some aspect of their personal information hoovered up by the PLA on the MSS on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. And that is used. It's used to establish intelligence connections. It's used for blackmail. It's used for understanding the way other countries work. And our kind of existing security frameworks aren't really adapted for that. So I completely applaud the efforts of the OSCE to try and find areas on which we can agree. And I think there are those. I think that with goodwill, and I'm not sure there is goodwill, but if there is goodwill, for example, we could look at reviving some kind of military to military framework, perhaps a kind of new CFE treaty, where we would look at the most dangerous aspects of the East-West military confrontation, particularly snap exercises. These are open to misunderstanding. They are frequent on the Russian and Belarusian side. If we want to start restoring trust and reducing the potential for misunderstanding, having some rules about snap exercises, about transponders on planes in international airspace and so on, that would be a good place to start. If we build that sort of trust, then we can maybe move on to other things. I think that but there's a whole swathe of what the OSCE used to do, you know, the national minorities work, the ODIHR, the election monitoring work, the freedom of the media work, all those rest on a sort of normative consensus that just isn't there anymore. It's not only not there in terms of relations between Russia and the West, it's actually not there within the West. We have sharply different views between, say, in what Hungary regards as national control of its information space and what Turkey regards as acceptable, and what goes as in most of the rest of Europe. So I'm pretty pessimistic about this. I think that we face enormous obstacles. I'm afraid, speaking bluntly, I think the OSCE is out. It was founded in a different era on different normative and legal foundations, but we mustn't give up. We have to just keep on going and trying to find areas where we can cooperate and work on those and hope that the weather changes, which I always hope living in Britain.
Thank you very much, Ed. Indeed, I knew that you would bring a bit of a more candid view as an external to the OSCE, but I do want to go back to the idea of continuing to try and see what platforms are still relevant or can still be used to build that common ground where the parties can come together at the same table. And maybe even if they don't trust each other, they share that information and continue to communicate because they know it's also in their self-interest to avoid a catastrophic incident or an accident, or just, making sure that the others know what they're up to. And now I want to move to you, Julie, because you come also from Norway, a NATO country, a non-EU country, an OSCE participating state, but also part of a region where there is more and more competition or visible competition between Russia and the West, not just in terms of military exercising and posture, but also energy security issues and so on and so forth. So how are things more from the Nordic front? And is cooperation or cooperative security and a policy that could be applied at least at that region level?
Thank you, and thank you for letting me join. I will try to bring in some perspectives from up north, and I would agree to start out with both Edward and Alexandra that we really need to be very realistic about the current state of affairs. I think the big question, and where we might disagree, Edward and I, is what do we do about it? And how do we fix it? So I see a national and international situation of enormous complexity, a growing feeling that things are really falling apart in many places, and that potential partners are becoming enemies in very many relations. So I'm keeping my eyes on the political leadership because that's where I expect things to be fixed. So it's clear that for some political leaders, this is a possibility to increase their own power to secure themselves and their own unit. For others, the complexities at home seem to divert them from taking responsibility to preserving peace internationally. For yet others, it seems to give them a feeling of not being in power. So to make cooperative security work again, I think political leaders need to become realistic about the situation, including, for me, the fact that fending solely for your own security and interests now is going to make us all very much less secure. So, for example, if we take the case of Belarus, construing the Belarusian opposition as a Western color revolution, as a part of some kind of NATO offensive on the Russian side, or construing Lukashenko as a Russian proxy, which we therefore have to bring down on the Western side, I think can help bring a conflict into being that is not in the security interest of anybody, not the Belarusian people, not Russia, not the West. Then to make cooperative security work again, political leaders who have a feeling of not being in power, I think have to understand that power and responsibility is something that you take and make. And I think I'm speaking to my own leaders now in Norway. We have a discussion going on whether Norway should sign the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, a treaty which Norway actually was very keen to help develop at the outset. So we have op-eds in the Norwegian media of former prime ministers and foreign ministers campaigning for Norway to sign, but that we have the powers that be who have presented what they think is the realistic perspective here and say that the big powers are not signing, therefore it would be stupid for us to sign. I think that is in a way giving up on using the power that you have to impact the situation we're in. So on the question of what are the key areas we need to cooperate on, I think we need to continue to address the most difficult issues. I think we need to continue addressing Ukraine, however difficult it is going to be. And even if we have to compromise on things we really don't want to compromise on. And if I were to look to Norway, we have a problem because we have a deteriorating relation with Russia. But the only thing we speak about Russia with are the kind of practical bilateral issues where we have managed to cooperate easily. Whereas the core bone of contention here is, of course, the increasing Russian military activity as well as the increasing NATO presence in the high north. And I think Russian and Norwegian leaders need to speak about that problem and not act as if it doesn't exist. Then secondly, the need to hold on to functioning trust building and crisis management mechanisms, such as military to military contact in the high north. Post the crisis in Ukraine and Russia's annexation of Crimea, the military exercises which the Norwegian army or the Norwegian military and the Russian military had been undertaking together, for example, sailing warships into the Russian economic zone, those exercises, that collaboration, which was a trust-building exercise, have stopped. Instead, we had just a couple of weeks ago, Norwegian warships sailing with US and British warships into the Russian economic zone, and of course, eliciting very harsh Russian criticism. Then thankfully, we have not stopped the direct contact between the Norwegian joint headquarters and the head of the Northern Fleet, who could then speak, you know, on the very same day, take contact and just reassure each other. But the need to preserve the mechanisms that we actually have, I think, is very urgent, and enhance them if possible. Then finally, I would just like to make a very, in a way, obvious point, but which does not seem to be obvious any longer. And that is that we should, or that leaders should stop looking at who takes the initiative if the initiative is constructive. If it is, support it. So on Monday, US and Russian negotiators made some progress on a new framework accord that would freeze nuclear arsenals and outline parameters for extending the New START treaty after 2021. I agree, there are probably no big hopes, but still, I think it is a bad argument to say, and typical of actors in today's complex and very polarized world, that, oh, this is the Trump administration's initiative, therefore it must not be supported or taken seriously. I think leaders cannot afford not to take good initiatives from people they don't trust seriously these days, and simply just try to build on them. Yeah, so I think that would be my points which I have to offer. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Yes, I think that we all are in agreement that we need to use the mechanisms that are in place. We need to start reusing them, or we need to start making the most out of the mechanisms that are in place. And we need to talk about the hard things as well, not only about the easy ones. I think the secret is in the sequencing as well. I want to hand over to Alexandra as my co-moderator to follow up with questions to each one of you. But I want to remind our participants that please be active and ask questions either through the chat function or raise your hand to get on camera and directly approach one or the other of the panelists. So Alexandra, to you with the more difficult questions now coming to our speakers.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you for an excellent panel, which in a way is exactly the kind of the picture of our target audience for the CSI. We have two diplomats with Thomas Graving and Luca Frattini, and I would like to address the first kind of batch of questions to them. And we have two experts, Julie Williamson, who in fact is part of the Cooperative Security Initiative, one of our 19 experts, and Edward Lucas. So allow me to start with the first question directed to Thomas and Luca. We've heard in a quite provocative but very welcome way, indeed, that the OSCE is perhaps outdated in many ways, because as Edward Lucas said, it was founded on legal principles which are perhaps not that applicable today, and the whole environment is different. So how to update the OSCE now, given the current developments? And in particular, I would like you both to address the question, so how to cooperate when values and democratic norms are not shared? I know that's the question that you have been wrapping up your mind around for a long time, but we would be very happy if you shared your thoughts with us. So please, maybe Thomas could start, and then Luca. Thank you.
You're still muted, Thomas.
So, all right. But thanks for these also critical perspectives from outside of the OSCE. I would argue that the OSCE offers fundamentally serves two very different objectives. On the one hand, it represents principles and commitments, soft law, that the participating states have subscribed to over the last 45 years. And on the other, it serves as a platform for inclusive dialogue. Now, I would agree, of course, the Charter of Paris kind of portrayed a worldview that we would all share basic values, and that basically we would have more or less reached the end of history. We have realized by now that this is clearly not the case, and so I think we have to clearly acknowledge that the OSCE turned into a gathering of non-like-minded states. I think this needs to be acknowledged, and we have to deal with it. At the same time, I would argue, and this takes me to the OSCE as a dialogue platform, and also OSCE's instruments to manage, to prevent conflict. Here, I would argue, well, initially, at the very outset of CSE's history, the OSCE or the CSE was created to do exactly that, to provide in an extremely tense situation a platform where all key stakeholders would sit at the same table and try to prevent an escalation of the Cold War. And I think we are probably today again closer to that main objective of the organization, where we have to kind of prevent perhaps not intentional but accidental escalations, and so I would argue the OSCE is clearly not only a good weather organization, but also one capable of confronting bad weather. And yeah, I would agree. Today we are confronting bad weather. And so in bad weather, you need a place where you can talk to. But also, and this is perhaps responding to Edward's point on OSCE's institutions that indeed were built on a normative consensus that is only partly out there today. Again, I would differentiate between the practice and formally questioning principles and commitments. Nobody questions formally principles and commitments that have been agreed. That is quite interesting, and I think that is a basis to work on. But of course, in reality, there is a lot of questioning still. If you look at the tools of ODIHR, electoral observation, the High Commission on National Minority, silent diplomacy, if you look what these instruments are impacting in the current situation, you see that they're still extremely valid, extremely timely. But again, and this is where I would conclude, these instruments are only useful when they're being used by stakeholders, by participating states. Only then, you know, the conflict cycle, the toolbox makes sense when these instruments are being picked up and used. So at the end of the day, it's still up to participating states to make sense out of this organization.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Your perspective as the former Secretary General against all the background is very important. Luca, I would like to give you the chance to respond to this provocative question, how to update the OSCE and how to get along with members who don't share the values.
Definitely a challenging one, and I thank you for the question. Actually, it's a very important question, which I feel, and that is part of my reply, we are not working sufficiently on trying to answer that question. And I welcome every opportunity that is provided to do so. Let me start by saying that Edward is fully right. The OSCE as such, with the O, was built out of the previous CSCE conference in a totally different political environment. And this explains the current polycentric nature of the organization. You know, yesterday I was welcoming a new person in the Secretariat staff. She's actually from Norway and she comes from the military. And the first advice that I gave her when she entered the premises was, please forget about any military hierarchy or way of functioning, because here I might be the deputy commander-in-chief, but the authority is actually very limited. And Thomas will probably remember that even when he was the Secretary General, you could easily face a situation where one head of mission, randomly chosen, say in Turkmenistan or in Kosovo, would reply to him that the head of mission is on equal footing with the Secretary General. So this is reflects, in my opinion, the complexity of an organization which was born in the early 90s with an institutional setup which was meant for the early 90s. But now in 2020, it's increasingly challenging to run it smoothly with those institutions. And this leads me to the second consideration, which is we would so badly need a summit. You know, Astana is the only summit that this organization has had in the 21st century. It means one in 20 years. And if you think of how the institutional setup was drafted in the early 90s with the Charter of Paris, the Helsinki +20 document, etc., well, theoretically, we should have one every 2 years, but this is not happening, and it hasn't been happening for a long time. And we have a great opportunity, in my opinion, ahead of us, which is called 2025, the date when the OSCE, CSE will turn 50. And I think there is an excellent possibility to launch a reflection in view of what we want to become in 5 years down the line. And I think this is consistent with the question that was raised before by Alexandra on how do you see cooperative security and the European security architecture 5 or 10 years down the line. Well, in order to do that, and if we want to get to 2025 with something tangible in hand, I dare say that we need to start now working on it. And the way to go about it is multifaceted, if you want, because of course, there's a intergovernmental component, and that is the job of the successive chairpersonships of the OSCE to steer this reflection. Unfortunately, we only have 2 decided chairpersonships so far. We will have Poland after Sweden, and then that's it. So we don't even know who will be taking over in 2023, 24, and 25 yet. Then there is, of course, the track 2 component, and the role of academia and civil society could never be stressed good enough, because I think you people working from and looking at us from the outside have a formidable role of propelling the organization to meet the challenges. And then, and I will close with this, please let's not underestimate the potential and the role of the parliamentary diplomacy. We have a parliamentary assembly which is very active and whose members are currently, as we speak, discussing these topics. Probably they have more freedom than we have, because of course in the intergovernmental side you are bound by the decisions taken by the participating states, whereas a parliamentary forum is by definition something where members can speak freely. And probably that is where I would hope we will have the biggest push in favor of comprehensive rethinking of the OSCE and its role in the next 5 years. Over to you.
Thank you, Luca. I would now like to pose a question to Julie and Edward, perhaps starting with Edward. Julie said that taking care of your own security will make us all less secure. And this is pretty much the thought at the heart of cooperative security. And I can imagine that you two maybe have diverging views on that. So my question is deterrence and taking care of our own security kind of good enough to make us all more secure? Or do we need other approaches? And perhaps to make it a bit more plastic, if we think now of conflicts like in Belarus or Nagorno-Karabakh, isn't a cooperative security approach the most successful one and the most promising to solve those conflicts in a really sustainable manner? I would be very happy to hear your thoughts. Edward, you have the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, on Belarus, I don't quite recognize the way in which Julie described it. We are not, I think, as sympathetic outsiders, treating this as if it was Maidan 2.0. It's very clear from the demonstrations. This is not fundamentally about geopolitics. It's about internal democratic processes. And I think that the Western approach is quite right here. We are putting pressure on the regime because of its abuses of human rights. And we are saying to Putin, please keep your hands off Belarus. I wish in both cases we'd done it earlier and done it more. But I think that is broadly the right approach. This is not a Western-inspired color revolution. I think more broadly, that deterrence is a very important part of security. And I'd agree that we don't want to be in a position where the Baltic states have their own individual nuclear deterrence because they don't trust NATO or trust the United States nuclear umbrella. Deterrence works best when it's broad and multi-layered, but also when it's very credible. And I want to pick up also on what Julie said about the NATO's military presence in the High North. It's worth remembering that we had pretty much 10 years in the 1990s when NATO made no plans and had no capabilities to defend the countries that were becoming its new members. That changed, and it changed for a very specific reason, that Russia just started building up its forces. And we saw, for example, the Zapad 09 exercise, which rehearsed the invasion and occupation of the Baltic states and culminated with a dummy nuclear strike on Warsaw. That was a very clear wake-up call to NATO that you need to do something if your if your deterrent is to be credible. Also in Norway, you had a simulated air attack on a very important military base in northern Norway, and I think 1997, and also a Russian military exercise which grounded all the helicopters going to that was a naval exercise, grounding the helicopters that supply your North Sea rigs. So Russia, for its own reasons, decided that it wanted to adopt a much more combative, much sharper military posture. And that's fine, Russia can do that. But if Russia does that, then it must expect us to respond. And I think the danger is that you have a security problem which requires a deterrent response. And then when you try and do that deterrent response, whether it's through greater resilience or actually active deterrence, then people say, oh, hang on, that's not very cooperative. Why are you having exercises? Why are you changing your military posture? That, you should be engaged in dialogue, not confrontation. Well, it takes two sides to have a dialogue, and I think that it's important that we retain our ability to have a strong collective defence with escalation, with every bit of the escalation ladder covered. It's very destabilising, and I think this gets into the Norwegian nuclear debate. It's very destabilising if Russia has the absolute escalation dominance at the bottom of the nuclear ladder. That means that Russia is, I would say that makes war more likely, and I fully understand the reasons why Norwegian politicians are hesitant about signing that treaty.
Thank you very much. And over to Julie, same question, and perhaps you want to respond to what
yes,
Edward just said.
Admit that was a huge load of questions brought up there, and I think I'm just going to stick to your questions, Alexandra. And on the first one, I agree with Edward Lucas that this is not the picture we have in Belarus today, and that is great. But I'm watching developments, and I think it's more my fear that it might end up like that. And there are certainly signs on the Russian side that it might. I mean, the talk about color revolutions and NATO exercises close to the Belarus-Russian border has already been there in both Russian and Belarusian rhetoric. Then on the question of deterrence, yes, I agree. I mean, Norway practically eradicated the entire defense of our territory after the end of the Cold War. And I think many today would agree that that was not a smart thing to do. So in a way, it's a bit by default that we now have the combination of suddenly Norway wanting to really be NATO in the north and deteriorating Russia-West relations at the same time. It's a kind of unhappy mismatch. But I would still like to stress that this belief that deterrence is going to fix things up there is wrong. As I see things happening here, it is escalating the situation that both sides think that building up is going to scare the other part off. And I went to listen to Admiral Foggo, who was the man who headed the huge NATO exercise Trident Juncture. He came to Oslo and presented the rationale for that exercise. And his line of reasoning was that NATO needed to project power, as huge power, as close to the Russian border and kind of the Northern Fleet as possible, and that would make Russia withdraw. But I study basically just Russian politics, And that's not how it's working with Russia today. If you move even closer now, they are going to hit back, and we are going to get a dangerous situation. And that is what I see happening up here in the last couple of years. And for Norway, actually, our traditional approach to the Soviet Union was a mixture between deterrence and reassurance, which actually was concrete signaling. You know, we would not house nuclear weapons in Norway. We would not have US bases stationed in Norway, and so on. So I think that combination of seeing what Russia has been doing in the north, modernizing its very, I mean, totally broken down actually military capabilities, that is, as we used to call it before 2015, Norwegian politicians called it the normalization of the Russian armed forces in the north. Then it has been, now it's called something different. But I think we need to find a way of NATO to, and Norway in particular, to build up a policy that, yes, we can defend our own territory, our own country, but we are reassuring you that we are not going to threaten your security, which obviously Russia thinks. So that would be my response.
Thank you very much, Julie. We approach the final round. I mean, we still have a quarter of an hour, but I think we need this time so that each of us can still have a final statement, which I would like to connect to some of the questions that have been posed in the chat. And each of you I will address a question to each of you, and then it's up to you if you want to add something else, since it's the last chance. Luca, I would like to start with you in this case. And it is a question about the role of leadership. We heard it from Julie that that's her hope, and in a way she would like to address the leaders to take up this painful, long process towards cooperative security. And one of the participants in our chat was also interested about this question of leadership. Do you think this is the cure, this is the way to go forward, or do we need to start completely differently to get back to cooperative security? Luca, please, thank you.
Another challenging one. I'm happy that you're throwing such a level of challenging questions, because, you know, we are very often stuck in the day-to-day business, even we working inside the structure. And it's very good that sometimes we have the opportunity to think a little bit aloud. And in this case, well, for an organization like the OSCE, as I said before, I think leadership, meaning political leadership, is of essence. We cannot move an inch without the approval, be it explicit or tacit, by the countries that are in the lead of the organization. And that happens to be a chairmanship or chairpersonship, as our Swedish friends will call it, as from 1st of January next year, to use a more gender neutral term. You will not have such thing as a consistent approach from year to year, because this is not the EU or other organizations where you have a rotating system. There was talks about a rotating system in the past. It didn't end up materializing, but with the current situation, with the 1 year cycle and with decisions on the successive chairmanships having to be taken at the ministerial level, you don't have such thing as a continuity of political leadership and action in the organization. So one element here that I would strongly advocate for is to strengthen as much as possible the role of the Troika, which is the only existing mechanism to ensure at least a 3-year view of what lies ahead with the outgoing, the current, and the incoming chairmanships. And that is already a remedy, but partial. Then responding to your question, where do we take it? Is it bottom up or top down? Well, I would say the two need to be combined. And the way I see things is, okay, yes, let's have the leaders lead us, which they do by definition, but at the same time, sometimes they need to be stimulated from a different angle. And there is where I believe that an initiative such as the Cooperative Security Initiative or other similar initiatives, plus the parliamentary role, all together can create a mass critique of push for our political leaders to dwell more thoroughly on issues such as relaunching multilateralism, and why not relaunching the OSCE, which again comes at a cost, because to relaunch the OSCE you have to invest in it.
Thank you very much, Luca. I would like now to come to Thomas Greminger and ask him for his final remarks, and also ask him to respond to the question from the chat from Cornelia, who brings up the term of collective security as opposed to cooperative security. Could you perhaps say us a few words about the difference from your perspective, and who are actually the actors whom we have in mind when we speak of cooperative security? Because after all, the concepts seem very similar, and even NATO has the term cooperative security in one of its founding documents. Please, Thomas.
Yeah, okay, that's a conceptual question. Well, collective security is about a defense treaty among a number of states. I think we refer to collective security when we talk about the Locarno Agreement of, I think, 1926, but obviously what comes today to our mind is NATO. That is the collective security organization. Now, collective security does not exclude cooperative security, and you know, this gives me a chance to recall NATO's Harmel Doctrine of 1967, that on the one side, of course, underlines the relevance of deterrence, and that was very important back then, is very important today, no question about it. But the Harmel Doctrine also points to a second pillar, and that is the pillar of détente, the pillar of dialogue, the pillar of entertaining good relations with good diplomatic relations with your perceived adversaries. And I think that is as relevant today as it was back then. And in particular, and this is perhaps coming back to Edward's point on these recent exercises close to borders. I mean, what worries me is that we see them on both sides. There is clearly a tremendous increase of its frequency. Often they do have, they contain snap elements, and this clearly also implies a risk of non-intentional escalation. And I think this should urgently be addressed. And again, I come back to my initial statement. I think there are in theory platforms at the OSCE that you could use to sort these issues out and to prevent unintentional escalations. Perhaps a last point, since this is my last chance to have the floor on leadership. I totally agree with Luca. I also support his proposal to launch a political diplomatic process that would prepare us for celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki final accord. And that would perhaps allow us to recommit to these principles, to try at least seriously to move towards, again, a more common understanding of what these principles imply today. I think this is indeed, of course, something where the Troika assumes a responsibility, has an opportunity to take up such an initiative, but at the same time there are 57 participating states, and they should, I think, not only be watching what the chair or the Troika undertakes, but also contribute actively. And for this, I think we need to bring the OSCE more regularly back to the radar, the attention of ministers. And I think here we have a huge challenge. Informal ministerials seem to become some sort of a habit in recent years. I think this should be continued. I think ministers should more regularly, more systematically be dealing with OSCE-related issues, and such a political process could obviously contribute to that. Back to you, Alexandra.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you very much for these programmatic words. I believe that even though you're not SG anymore, you're a big moral authority still for most participating states and members of the Secretariat. Thank you. Edward, now to you. I would like to play back this provocative statement about the outdatedness of the OSCE and ask you about your own vision. As you remember, we presented the clock with the 4 possible options for the future scenarios. I would like to ask you to share with us your vision, and feel free to interpret the word vision either as a dream or as what you deem most realistic. How do you see the future of the OSCE area? Mike, please.
So I remember the Helsinki Accords very clearly from the 1970s. And I think we need to go back to the pre-OSCE era, to a CSC era, where we accept that there is basically a division of Europe, and that it's not a complete polarization. Back in those days, we had countries like Yugoslavia and Albania and Romania, which was all in slightly different relations to the West, as well as the sort of core Warsaw Pact. But I think the CSC showed that we could talk about things, and we could find wiggle room on both sides in some cases, and that would be a good start. I would pay particular attention to military transparency, and I think that it's very easy to caricature deterrence and say, oh, the deterrence people think that's all you need is nuclear weapons. And I'm absolutely not saying that. But for example, we could talk about observers on exercises. It's absolutely clear Russia's going to have exercises, whether they're Zapad, Kavkaz, or whatever, center, and they will be of great interest to us. Russia did not allow any meaningful Western military observation or monitoring of those exercises, and that makes people scared. It makes people scared in Norway, it makes them scared in the Baltic states and in Poland. By contrast, Steadfast Jazz, Trident Juncture, Amber Coast, and these other ones, we do have monitors. Probably we could have more. But I think that monitoring the exercises and making it clear, yes, we will be going into your economic zone, just as you go into our economic zone. That's normal. These are international waters. That's allowed. Let's try and do this in a way that doesn't waste everyone's time and shreds everyone's nerves. I think that's a good way forward. And if we succeed in that, then maybe we can start building some more trust and cooperation on other issues. But I think the one thing one can say is that neither Moscow nor Beijing nor Washington nor Brussels actually wants to have a war by accident. And at least on that, there is some sort of common interest. I think from that one could also perhaps go on to space, which is another sort of contested and very unclear domain where there's a lot of common interest in not having things like space debris and regulating the, what do we do about about weapons in space. But I'll stop there and thank you. And I'm sorry if I've come across as rather gloomy and combative. I'm actually a very nice person and very optimistic. But I want to say thank you again to the organisers for having hosting this side event.
Thank you very much, Edward, and also thank you for highlighting that there are common interests and that there's still some hope for cooperation, perhaps. I would like now to address Julie with a question from Anastasia from the chat. She reminds us that the criticism of the OSCE has been around for years. It's nothing new. But why do you think the debate is so stuck, both in the academia and at the policy level? You have been observing it very closely, especially from the academia level. So I bet you have an interesting response here, and why the breakthrough is not possible so far. Julie, please.
I think it's interesting when you study conflicts which you are not yourself a part of. It's very easy to understand both sides and understand why you have a conflict. But when you become part of the conflict you're trying to study, that is much more difficult as a researcher. And I think maybe that's the core problem here. That both actors and even academics, we are suddenly almost on the side in a conflict, and it's easy then to stop looking at and trying to understand, not excuse or condone, but simply trying to understand why is my counterpart acting as he is. So I think that's the big problem here, that at least if you speak about, you know, the Russia-West conflict, we're all so very much a part of it and have a stake in it. And then it's very difficult to keep this bird's perspective, which we really need to keep having. What does it look like from the other side? Is there any point where I can try to listen and maybe even compromise to meet the other side and to de-escalate? So I think that I mean, and it's not only the OSCE. You can take nearly any organization or forum where the actors meet now. It's all very, very politicized, very, very stuck. So this is a general problem, and it just mirrors the conflict. And it's quite obvious that it comes into the OSCE as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. I would now like to use the opportunity to address one final question, which is also at the same time my final remark, because again, Cornelia addressed us through the chat with a question about the survey. And I'm very glad to, in a few seconds, to give you an overview of our respondents and the issue of representativity, which is not at stake here. Just to remind you, it was a qualitative expert survey, if you will, but I didn't use the word expert because we had not only experts among our respondents, so people working as researchers on foreign and security policy issues. We also had students of international relations. We had diplomats and people working in the private and public sector. In terms of the demographics, we have slightly more men than women, which I think slightly represents how the interest is in the field. And interestingly, we have 60%, about 60% of people below 40, which is, I think, a very interesting demographics, because it shows first that young people, at least in this non-representative survey, but still where 300 people were ready to, you know, invest at least 30 minutes of time and actually write a quite long text addressing 19 questions. These questions interest young people to a slightly more extent that they, in this case, interested the older population, whom we would expect to deal with those issues maybe in the first place. So yeah, 300 respondents from across the OSCE area, slightly younger than older and slightly more male than female, with a majority of them, 2/3, coming from the expert and student groups, and the other ones from diplomatic, public and private sector. I'm again very glad. I will give Alex Martin, of course, back the word, but let me thank you now already for engaging with Cooperative Security Initiative. Take the chance, if you feel like, to fill out the survey, which you can find under cooperative-security-initiative.org. We are happy also to analyze your opinion, because we keep on looking at the responses, and our next presentation will be probably at the Basel Forum, and if we're lucky, we get into the Munich Security Conference with a side event, and we'll be very happy to present the results there too. So please join the Cooperative Security Initiative and spread the word. And I give back to Alex Martin.
Thank you, Alexandra. Just final last thanks to the entire panel and the participants today. I think we did have a more non-OSCE conversation than usual, at least the ones that I used to attend that were not as interactive as this one. And to make sure that everyone knows, we did take notes in addition to recording the event, so we will share these notes with the group that attended today, and we will be able to keep everyone up to date. The recording will go on the Cooperative Security Initiative website, so others could also listen to these ideas. What I think is very important, I think there are 3 points that I will take with me at the end of it, is one, the effort of making OSCE up to date. I think that's something that's in the making, and that needs to be an effort, a multi-stakeholder effort, not just on behalf of the Secretariat or just a few participating states. The second part is the whole idea of reconceptualizing cooperative security, or making sure that the expectations are managed and meet the reality. And third, the need for dialogue and rebuilding trust, even when we don't share necessarily the same views of the world. Only with dialogue and trust, we will be able to make sure that, one, we tackle shared security challenges, and two, prevent any possible accident that neither party will actually be interested in having. So with that being said, thank you for being part of the CSI side event, a project jointly run by GLOBSEC and FESROCPE, and thanks for being part of GLOBSEC Forum 2020. Quite a challenging year to be gathering. Have a good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for being together.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.